In 1677, a 12-year-old girl was married off with a dowry nobody wanted, a waterlogged swamp on the outskirts of London that her new husband's family considered nearly worthless. That swamp is now Mayfair and Belgravia, two of the most expensive neighborhoods on Earth. When her descendant, Hugh Grosvenor, inherited it in 2016, all 300 acres of it, all 12 billion pounds of it, the British press braced for what would have been the largest inheritance tax bill in history. The actual bill? Zero. This isn't a story about dumb luck. It's the story of a family that spent 350 years quietly engineering an empire that no government, no market crash, and no inheritance law could touch. They did it using a medieval land system most people have never heard of, a legal structure so airtight it's still working flawlessly today, and a level of patience that makes modern billionaires look reckless by comparison. The Grosvenors don't appear on rich lists. They don't give interviews. They don't need to. Because they quietly own London. Imagine waking up on your 25th birthday and realizing you now own a meaningful share of one of the most expensive cities on the planet, not some overlooked outskirts, Mayfair and Belgravia. If you've ever played Monopoly, these are literally the two most valuable squares on the board. For Hugh Grosvenor, this was not a daydream. Hugh is the direct descendant, 7 generations removed, of Sir Thomas Grosvenor, the man who married into that swampy land back in 1677. For over 300 years, the family refused to sell a single piece of it. Land was handed down, generation after generation, until it landed in Hugh's possession. That inheritance became reality in 2016 when Hugh's father died unexpectedly. Overnight, Hugh became the 7th Duke of Westminster and inherited an estate worth over 12 billion pounds. To put that scale in context, this 25-year-old instantly became landlord to 300 acres of London's most valuable real estate, alongside substantial holdings in Scotland and Spain, and an 11,500-acre estate in Cheshire. That empire now operates as the Grosvenor Group. Its scale is large enough that the firm recently announced plans to sell off roughly $954 million in U.S. real estate simply to rebalance its global portfolio. Meanwhile, the UK portfolio alone cleared nearly $115 million in a single year, largely from renting high-end shops, offices, and apartments across London's West End. All of this traces back to one decision made over 300 years ago, turning a useless waterlogged piece of mud into the foundation of a financial empire. So, the real question is, how exactly do you turn a literal swamp into a multi-billion-dollar dynasty? To understand how this happened, we have to go back to 1677. At the time, the area west of London bore no resemblance to the luxury district we know today. It was rural, muddy, and largely undeveloped countryside. Everything changed when Sir Thomas Grosvenor married a young woman named Mary Davies. In elite circles of the era, marriage functioned essentially as a corporate merger. Land was the currency of the aristocracy, and because Mary was very young and vulnerable, she needed the protection of a powerful family structure to safeguard her assets from rival claims. The marriage secured exactly that. As part of the union, Mary brought a 500-acre dowry north of the River Thames into the Grosvenor family, land that, at the time, almost nobody considered valuable. It consisted of open fields, pasture, and undrained marshland. Economically, it was essentially dormant, what a modern investor would call a low-yield asset with no clear future value. The Grosvenor family already held a strong power base at Eaton Hall in Cheshire, with territory dating back before the 15th century. That northern land delivered political influence, seats in parliament, control over regional politics, but little room for real economic expansion. The swampy southern land near London represented an entirely different kind of opportunity, even though it produced almost no income at the time. The family faced a choice: sell the swamp or invest in preserving it. They chose preservation. It was, by any measure, a genuine gamble. Family archives reveal just how much was at stake. Old ledger books show the estate spending considerable sums building and maintaining river walls, an engineering effort to hold back the Thames and convert the marshland into usable pasture. Against the odds, the bet began to pay off. Local farmers used the reclaimed land for small-scale market gardening, while others cultivated osier beds, plots of willow trees grown specifically to harvest flexible wood for basket weaving. By renting this land out to farmers and basket weavers, the Grosvenors generated a steady stream of income that covered the cost of maintaining the expensive river walls entirely. The land was now paying for its own survival, without the family spending a dime of additional capital. They had tamed the mud. They were now perfectly positioned for the next move, one that would trap London's wealthiest residents in a legal arrangement they could never fully escape. The trap was sprung in the 1720s. Before this point, landowners typically sold off land outright whenever they needed quick capital. The Grosvenors did something different, and at the time, genuinely novel, with a new development called Mayfair. The family refused to let people build however they wanted. Instead, they imposed a strict master plan, wide streets, grand public squares, and a requirement that Britain's wealthiest residents construct substantial mansions. But buried inside the arrangement was the real innovation. The Grosvenors granted long-term leases to tenants, while retaining the freehold ownership of the land itself. Freehold ownership means owning the land itself, permanently. A leasehold means a tenant buys only the right to use a building on that land, for a fixed number of years. When the lease term ends, both the building and the land revert entirely back to the landowner. The wealthy built the mansions. The Grosvenors kept the ground underneath them, forever. Robert Grosvenor, the family's sharpest business mind, ran the Mayfair operation on the ground well before receiving his official noble title in 1733. While his older brother remained at the family's country estate, Robert lived directly amid the construction, setting up residence on Upper Grosvenor Street in the middle of an active building site. Robert didn't lay a single brick himself. Instead, he opened the development to speculative builders, early real estate developers eager for profit. These builders signed subleases, financed construction with their own capital, and sold finished townhouses to wealthy buyers. The strategy worked extraordinarily well. More than 200 different developers flooded into Mayfair to claim a share of the opportunity. And that diversity of builders is precisely why Mayfair still has such striking architectural variety today, rather than a single repetitive style. Every building sits on the same underlying legal structure. The shift from a local housing project to genuine urban dominance accelerated in the early 19th century, as London expanded faster than ever before. In 1831, Robert Grosvenor became the first Marquess of Westminster, a significant upgrade in status that came with real political power. He used it to develop land southwest of Mayfair, between Hyde Park and the Thames, immediately adjacent to Buckingham House as it was being transformed into the official royal palace. Grosvenor understood that the aristocracy would pay almost anything to live near the throne. The family stopped simply building houses and began constructing entire high society districts, launching the development of Belgravia and Pimlico on London's west side. To execute this at scale, they brought in Thomas Cubitt, a developer whose expertise extended well beyond architecture into large-scale construction coordination, working alongside surveyor Thomas Cundy. Together, they introduced standardized building designs and construction methods, allowing entire luxury districts to be built quickly and with consistent architectural quality. Crucially, the family still refused to sell their land outright. Instead, they relied on the same leasehold model at much greater scale. Properties were leased for 99 years, with tenants covering all construction costs plus an ongoing ground rent. When that 99-year term expired, the entire property, mansion and land together, reverted to the Grosvenors at no cost, ready to be re-leased at significantly higher modern rates. This single mechanism made the family among the wealthiest landowners in the entire British Empire. For a long stretch, the system seemed built to last indefinitely. Then global conflict intervened, and the conditions that had sustained it for 2 centuries began to break down. The First World War devastated most of Britain's historic landed families, though, notably, not the Grosvenors. For nearly everyone else, the war marked a genuine breaking point. Heirs and estate workers died together in the trenches. Domestic staff left for better-paying wartime jobs. Government taxation on landowners intensified sharply, Grand country houses that once buzzed with activity sat increasingly empty, beautiful, and increasingly impossible to sustain. The scale of the collapse was staggering. In 1919 alone, roughly 1 million acres of land went up for sale across England. By 1921, a full quarter of England had changed hands. An enormous portion of the old aristocracy simply disappeared from the historical record. While their peers panicked, the Grosvenors adapted. As bombing and economic disruption hit London's traditional business districts, the family opened up Mayfair properties to corporate tenants instead of relying solely on residential families. This was a sharp strategic read of a changing city. Buildings could now rise taller and faster, with far fewer constraints than before, fundamentally shifting what valuable land even meant in London. The Grosvenors leaned into this shift early, expanding into mansion blocks and commercial development, helping shape the skyline of modern London. They also supported social housing initiatives alongside reformers like George Peabody, a move that helped preserve a degree of public goodwill and influence that pure wealth alone couldn't buy. Calculating the Grosvenor family's peak net worth with precision is genuinely difficult. They disclose almost no financial data publicly, and their holdings span interconnected global property markets that resist simple valuation. Even conservative estimates place their worth at several £100 million at minimum, though most analysts consider that figure substantially understated relative to their actual holdings. For centuries, their entire model rested on one principle: never sell a single acre. Lease it instead, and let rental income compound year after year. That model worked beautifully until the early 20th century, when the family, like every other landed estate in Britain, ran headfirst into a combination of inflation, political hostility toward inherited wealth, and aggressive new taxation. This combination devastated old aristocratic wealth across England, wiping out families who couldn't adapt. To survive, the Grosvenors built what amounts to a legal fortress. Sometime in the mid-20th century, the family shifted their entire empire into discretionary trusts. In practice, this meant the family stopped owning the land as individuals. Instead, a permanent legal structure held that ownership on their behalf. Wealth stayed locked inside the trust rather than technically passing from parent to child. When a duke dies, there's no destructive inheritance tax event and no forced sale of family assets to cover a tax bill. The trust simply continues, and the family pays small, predictable fees instead of a catastrophic one-time tax. In the UK, inheritance tax on large estates is charged at 40%, with only a modest reduction available. Leaving 10% of an estate to charity brings that rate down to roughly 36%. For an ordinary family, that 40% tax can be enough to break apart a multi-generational estate entirely. The Grosvenor trust structure replaces that single devastating tax event with a periodic charge of roughly 6% every 10 years on the asset's value, a dramatically smaller, more predictable cost. The family also secured up to 100% tax relief on their farmland and agricultural buildings. The result is a system that compounds financial advantage across generations, entirely within the bounds of UK law. This is exactly the structure that allowed Hugh Grosvenor to inherit a £12 billion estate in 2016 without triggering the largest individual tax bill in British history. None of this fully makes sense without understanding how the family positioned itself for what came next. By the mid-20th century, the Grosvenors recognized a political shift building across Europe, governments tightening control over rents, land use, and private property rights. They anticipated correctly that British rental law would face sustained pressure from reform-minded governments determined to strengthen tenant protections. Rather than wait and react, they diversified early and went global. Today, the Grosvenor business operates internationally, expanding well beyond London streets into global urban property, food technology investment, and large-scale agricultural holdings. Their available financial disclosures point to a business that has remained resilient through difficult global markets, largely insulated by the corporate and trust structure built decades earlier. Modern London exists under genuinely difficult housing conditions. Social housing supply has sharply contracted, and prices have outpaced what most ordinary earners can afford. Foreign capital frequently treats luxury London property as a store of wealth rather than a place to live. reinforcing exclusivity in districts like Mayfair, while legacy landowners continue benefiting from that scarcity. According to UK government data, there are nearly 5 million leasehold properties in England, representing roughly 20% of the entire housing market. Critics argue this is a strange and outdated holdover from Britain's historical land system, and that it's striking how a medieval legal concept still shapes modern housing arrangements at this scale. It creates a striking parallel to modern tech platforms. Just as companies like Apple or Google control digital infrastructure and take a cut from anyone operating within their ecosystem, the Grosvenor family controls a piece of London's physical infrastructure, extracting a permanent toll from anyone who wants to operate within its most valuable real estate. They don't chase businesses or tenants. Because of how the underlying land is structured, businesses and tenants come to them. The Grosvenor story is fundamentally different from most tales of inherited wealth. It isn't a story of a fortune that simply survived by luck. It's a story of patient structural design, a family that, generation after generation, refused to sell, built a legal system most people have never examined closely, and adapted that system every time the political and economic landscape shifted beneath them. A swamp nobody wanted in 1677 became the financial bedrock for one of the most enduring private fortunes in modern history. Not because of one lucky break, but because of 3.5 centuries of consistent, deliberate decisions. The Grosvenors aren't the only dynasty that built lasting power through land, trusts, and legal structures most people never think to question. If you want to see how another family used a completely different playbook, built on global finance instead of land, go back and watch the Rothschild family episodes on this channel. If you enjoyed this kind of deep dive into how real wealth actually gets built and protected across generations, subscribe. There's a lot more of this hidden financial history still to uncover.